Right. So, good evening, guys. Thank you for joining me tonight. We are talking about a really interesting aspect of Jewish life, to me at least, which is the history and culture of Ethiopian Judaism. The reason that we're talking about this is not just because it's kind of an understudied part of Jewish life for most people who grew up in Ashkenazi communities, but also because it's actually a pretty major aspect of our calendar now. If you have a Hebrew calendar installed on your phone or you use one at home, you may notice that in a couple of days' time on November 4th, there's something marked called Sigd, which is maybe in brackets Ethiopian Jewish festival. And so as we have the opportunity this evening to schedule some adult education learning in the week in which Sigd falls, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the history of Ethiopian Judaism, about what Ethiopian Judaism is like today in Israel, and about the holiday of Sigd, which is coming up, and how it's practiced, and why I think it's probably quite significant even for us who are a long way from Ethiopia or Israel. Anyone have any experience previously with Ethiopian Jewish communities in Israel, elsewhere? No?
I know somebody whose son-in-law the daughter-in-law is Ethiopian.
Yeah.
And, I've sort of visited them in their home.
Yeah, brilliant. So it's definitely the case. Hi, Patricia. It's definitely the case that in the past generation, there's a lot more integration between Ethiopian communities and non-Ethiopian communities in Israel, at least. As a result, there's more opportunity for people to learn about the history of Ethiopian Jews, which is really quite interesting. So it's interesting for a few reasons. The first is because it definitely is a good challenge to the perceptions that a lot of people have about Judaism, Jews and non-Jews alike. In particular, the perception that Jews are always white and from Europe, which of course isn't true. And, you've heard me talk many times, if you're at Sam's around, about Sephardi Judaism, which of course is a very major aspect of Jewish life. But Ethiopian Judaism is a very small population, about 150,000 people. And so it usually doesn't get studied as much. But like Sephardi culture and Mizrahi culture and Taimani culture and other Jewish cultures, Ethiopian Judaism is a reminder that actually Jews are not a color or a cultural background. They don't have a certain type of name or a certain type of food. There's Jews from literally all over the world, and the diversity of Judaism is one of its strengths. So I think it's quite important in some way. I have a little presentation, just unusual for me, but I thought it'd be good for this topic at least. And I feel I just kind of talk us through it. And please just interrupt, shout things out as we go. I'm not an expert, by the way, I should say, in any means, on Ethiopian Judaism, just something that I've been interested in and learned a little bit about, both when I was in Israel and otherwise. And I think it's a good opportunity to talk about some of the issues that face the Jewish community today, particularly questions around how we get involved in racial justice work, and also what it means to talk about who Jews are or aren't. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so as the title of this evening's program said, I want to talk about Beta Yisrael, which obviously is a familiar phrase for many of us. In Hebrew, it's Beit Yisrael, House of Israel. The slight difference in Beta Yisrael is a reflection of the fact that the Jews of Ethiopia predominantly use a Semitic language which is not Hebrew, one of several Semitic languages, typically Amharic, or traditionally use a language called Ge'ez. This script that you see on the right-hand side, which says Beta Yisrael, is the Ge'ez script. It was an alphabet that was invented for the Ge'ez language, which is an ancient language, which emerged around the same time as Hebrew and Arabic as we know it now. And of the Semitic language family today, there's only really three major Semitic languages that are spoken any longer. Arabic, which of course accounts for like 99% of Semitic language speakers because of its widespread appeal, thanks to Islam. Hebrew, which of course has about 10 million native speakers, mostly thanks to the state of Israel and has Zionist education around the world. And the third is Amharic, which is one of the languages of Ethiopia, predominantly the north and northwest of Ethiopia, and is also a Semitic language, and in many ways is mutually intelligible with Hebrew and with Arabic. So it's an interesting comparison. It's the only other living Semitic language besides Hebrew and Arabic. And as I said, it's written in this alphabet called Ge'ez, which looks very funny, but actually is very phonetic, and is used not only for Amharic, but also for other Ethiopian languages, which are not Semitic. So the alphabet is in a lot of ways like the Latin alphabet serves in Europe. Latin alphabet is used for many languages that are not Latin, including English, of course, and many Latin-derived languages like French and Spanish. So wanted to start by talking a little bit about Ethiopia itself. So I don't know how many people have visited Ethiopia or spent time in the Horn of Africa, which is the region displayed on the map here. But it's quite important, actually, to understand the history of Jewish activity in Ethiopia. Few things to point out. One is that Ethiopia, which is here bounded by this kind of relieved line, is a multi-ethnic and multicultural country, like many countries that are the after effect of European colonialism. Ethiopia is a little bit less so than others, but similarly, there's basically 2 or 3, depending on how you count, major historic ethnic groups which are combined together in Ethiopia. This results in a lot of ethnic tension, as it does in many countries where there's artificial combinations of different ethnic groups. There's a big distinction between the north, where you see it says Amhara, which is one of the names for the north of Ethiopia, and that's where the language Amharic comes from, and the south of Ethiopia, which is represented by other ethnic groups, including the part of Ethiopia over here, which is largely populated by Somalis, and is as a result contested. So the part shaded in pink is contested between Somali and Ethiopia, and there's often been conflict along that border. The part shaded in pink over on the left here is contested between Sudan and Ethiopia. And the part contested, the part in yellow up here, is actually really important for us right now. And this is, as you see, labeled Tigray, which is where there's currently a war going on. I'm not sure how aware people are. It's not something that gets reported a lot in the news, but since about, I think November, it must be a year now, I think November 2020, there's been according to the government of Ethiopia, an insurgency of secession in Tigray. According to the people of Tigray, a massacre and genocide, and it's been extremely brutal and, as I said, vastly underreported. That's largely because the government of Ethiopia is an ally of Western countries. The president of Ethiopia received the Nobel Peace Prize only a few years ago, acknowledging his negotiation of a peace settlement with Eritrea, which is the country up here, which has a lot of similar cultural aspects to Ethiopia, but historically, for mostly because of European colonialism, have a lot of conflict. Today, Ethiopia is entirely inland, which is quite important. You can see the border is completely inland. The Horn, the coastal areas of the Horn, is now Somalia, which is a Muslim country, Djibouti, which is a mixed country but predominantly Muslim, and Eritrea, which is, like Ethiopia, predominantly Christian. One thing that's quite important to see, actually, is how small the distance is between the edge of the Horn of Africa and what's now Djibouti and Yemen, which, of course, is the southern part of Saudi Arabian Peninsula. That's quite significant to the history of Ethiopia, the fact this space is so small. It was quite easy to cross by boat. The Red Sea is the part that goes up. The Gulf of Aden is the part that goes down. Both of these feature very prominently because the Suez Canal, of course, above is cut through, and as a result, it's a very important shipping route. What's critical to us is understanding how Jews come into this. So Jews have been in Ethiopia. There's a kind of archaeological evidence of Jewish presence in Ethiopia since biblical times. Definitely since kind of Roman times. And it's likely that the Ethiopian community were Jews who were moved from Egypt down south through Sudan and into Ethiopia, but it's not certain exactly where they came from and how long they were there. They definitely trace their ancestry very far back, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but most Ethiopian Jews claim a descent from the tribe of Dan, which is one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and one of the 10 that were exiled in the Assyrian conquest in 722 BCE. Whether they've been there since 722 BCE, I don't think anyone can say for certain, but there's certainly been a very noticeable Jewish presence there since the Common Era, right, the year zero, and onwards. The presence was so large, actually, that the conflict between Judaism and Christianity actually led to several kind of civil wars in the area. And the center of that is a place called Aksum. You can see here in the Tigray section, I'll kind of zoom in, hopefully the zoom works. No, the zoom doesn't work. You'll see there's a city called Aksum, which is right near the border with Eritrea. Aksum was the center of an empire during kind of Roman times, basically 0 to 500 or so. It actually carried on longer than that, but it was only really in power for those 500 years. And Aksum is very significant because the kingdom of Aksum, the Aksumites, were the first real country to adopt Christianity in Africa, certainly, and one of the first in the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion. They adopted it sometime in the 4th century, kind of 330s, I believe, is when they trace that evangelism to, which makes it almost contemporaneous with the Byzantines, with Constantine, with the Roman Empire becoming Christian, and around the same time as Armenia, which is one of the first Christian countries, of course, north in the Caucasus, which develops a Christian idea as well. Aksum was a very wealthy and very powerful empire, and when they became Christianized, it caused a lot of conflict in the area. The center of that conflict was actually between two major powers, but ended up becoming fought between a Christian country, which is the Kingdom of Aksum, and a Jewish country, which is over across the strait in what's now Yemen. So I've got a map here to show that. So if you look on this map, you can see that what's colored in blue, this is the time, the 6th century, so this is the 500s. The blue is what's under the influence of Byzantium, including, of course, now the land of Israel and Egypt. And the green is what's under the influence of the Persian Empire. This is the Sasanian Persian Empire, which is very powerful as well. They kind of intersect right here in what's now Iraq, basically, in Mesopotamia, northern Syria. And as a result, their spheres of influence kind of went all throughout the area. So the kingdom of Aksum down here, when it became Christianized, became incorporated into this kind of Byzantine Christian culture. But it was very different in culture than the Byzantine, obviously, European Christianity. And the Coptic church in Egypt and the Ethiopian church in Aksum were some of the first major Christian powers. The other relevant power is this one in yellow called the Himyarite Kingdom. Anyone ever heard of the Himyars before? No. It's a shame, because it's actually really, really important. The Himyars were a Jewish kingdom in this time period. The government of the kingdom of Himyar decided to convert to Judaism around, depending on who you ask, around kind of the 400s or so. And it looks like most of the population converted to Judaism with them. So they became a Jewish kingdom in what's now Yemen, basically. And this is quite notable because at this time, of course, there's no Jewish settlement really in the land of Israel. Jews have been cast into the diaspora all throughout the world. There's a large Jewish settlement in the Persian Empire, in particular in Babylon. This is the time during which the Babylonian Talmud is being written, and Jews are seen as quite a significant and powerful minority in the Persian Empire, the Sassanids. The Persians were not Christians, nor Muslims, because there is no Islam. They were Zoroastrians, which is a dualistic religion that believes in a good God and a bad God that basically are at war with each other. They didn't mind the Jews. They were Jews very well tolerated in the Zoroastrian Persian Empire, as opposed to in the blue here, which is the Christian Byzantine Empire, where Jews were persecuted. So the Himyars convert to Judaism in order to ally themselves with the Persian Empire, thinking that makes them more like the Persians, and they know that the Jews are quite significant in Persia. And the result is that it puts them at war with the Christian world, in particular the Kingdom of Aksum, which is just across this tiny little border here, just across the Red Sea, the narrowest part. So as Christian missionaries move in, the result is a war in 525, which establishes the Kingdom of Aksum as the predominant Christian power and demolishes this Jewish kingdom called Himyar.
Sorry, Adam.
Yeah.
Who they convert to Judaism from what?
from the common pagan religion of the kind of pre-monotheistic Arabic pantheon.
Right.
There's a lot of people who feel it's just a kind of conversion of convenience. They just did it as a political gesture to kind of make themselves neutral, which didn't work. But actually, there's quite a bit of evidence that it was a sincere conversion. And one of the possible origins of the Ethiopian community is that when this war happened, there were so many people traveling back and forth across this strait that a lot of the Jews of Ethiopia may have been refugees from the kingdom of Himyar, who settled in the northern part of the kingdom where, for whatever reason, they may have been given some place to live, although they were treated as refugees and as a result discriminated against. The Jews of Ethiopia themselves generally don't tell this story. They tell the story that may be familiar to some of us of King Solomon, right, which is 1,500 years before the battle I'm talking about here. King Solomon ruled the united monarchy of Israel, the last king who ruled a united Jewish polity ever, around the year 1950 BCE. And there's several stories in the Book of Kings in the Tanakh. One of them involves a queen from a place called Sheba, who comes to King Solomon, and they have a famous kind of romance type scene, and she brings gifts and there's riddles and whatever. We don't actually get a lot of detail in the Tanakh itself, but there was a myth, folklore, legend that not only did the Queen of Sheba go to visit Solomon, but also that she was one of his wives, and that she conceived children as part of the Israelite Solomon's dynasty, and that she returned to her kingdom of Sheba, and as a result, the monarchy there can trace itself back to Solomon. Now, where Sheba is, the biblical Sheba, is confusing, because some people identify it as the Himyars in southern Yemen. Some people identify it as Aksum in northern Ethiopia. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that the Ethiopian Jews do see themselves as descendants of Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, and as a result, as Israelites through and through, and as noble Israelites who are directly related to this historic marriage between two kingdoms. Again, no one can really know much detail about these sort of things. We're dealing with folklore more than we are history. But it's really interesting to understand this very different history of Judaism, right? This isn't a history of their people that involves exile from the land of Israel, the destruction of the temple. That's not part of the story, right? Because either they left Israel long before the temple was destroyed, or they actually became a people long after the temple was destroyed, by virtue of the Himyarite Kingdom being destroyed and then being integrated into Ethiopia. So one way or another, it's actually just a very different Jewish story. It's not the Jewish story of we lived in the land of Israel and then the temple was destroyed and now we're in diaspora. They feel much more connected to Ethiopia historically, because either of these two origin stories means that their narrative is quite different. It also means they were quite cut off from the rest of the Jewish world. Whether it was in Solomon's time or much later, they didn't have much contact with the rest of the Jewish world, especially after the Himyars are gone. Everything around them is Christianized until Islam emerges a couple hundred years later, in which case you have different problems that come up. So the Jewish community of Ethiopia is clearly present and very strong in the kingdom of Aksum in northern Ethiopia, what's now northern Ethiopia, from the early part of the Common Era, in whatever way you calculate it, and settled predominantly in a series of cities in the north, and remained there up until the 20th century, and preserved there a great deal of Jewish practice and custom that actually was not preserved elsewhere, because the Jews elsewhere were more in contact with each other and more in contact with the civilization around them. So in some way, they became quite isolated, and as a result, give us a little window into what Judaism maybe looked like during the time when they were cut off from the rest of the Jewish world. Just a couple interesting medieval travelogues. There were lots of Jews who went on kind of trips around the world, like Marco Polo. Some very famously wrote books about their journeys, and everyone that did managed to go to Ethiopia, it seems. These two are quite late. These are 15th century. Both very prominent rabbis, one from Italy and one from Egypt. And you can see, just these are quotes from their own writings about it, that they experienced and encountered Ethiopian Jews. So Rabbi Ovadia from Bartanura, he's Italian, he saw two in Egypt. He said they're dark-skinned, and one could not tell whether they keep the teaching of the Kharites or of the rabbis. I'll explain what that means. For some of their practices resemble the Kharite teaching, but in other things they appear to follow the instruction of the rabbis, and they say they're related to the tribe of Dan. So it's really interesting, 1488, to see this Italian rabbi comment on this. Notably, what he's trying to point out is that he can't quite make sense of their type of Judaism. It doesn't quite look like his type of Judaism, which is the Judaism of the rabbis. And it might kind of look like a Judaism he's familiar with, which is called Kharit Judaism. Now, for those who haven't encountered this before, the Kharites are a Jewish group who rejected the oral law, meaning the Mishnah and the Talmud. So they kept the Torah and preserved the Torah, but rejected the kind of rabbinic layer that was built on top of that by the early rabbis. Those are the rabbis from the 1st to 3rd century predominantly. As a result, they're very much Jews. They do things like other Jews do, and obviously they're keeping the Torah, but in many key aspects they do things differently. So stuff around dietary laws, for instance. They don't have the separation in milk and meat because they read quite literally that it says in the Torah, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, and they go, great, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. They don't expand on things the way the rabbis do. But they also end up coming up with their own version of oral law, even though they don't call it the Talmud, because the reality is that the Torah doesn't tell us very much, right? There's a lot of stuff missing from the Torah. So the Kharites were, at one point, a very large community. Around the year 1000 CE, they were, in some places, 20, 30, 40% of the Jewish community. They had their own synagogues, they had their own rabbis, they had their own customs, and there are still Kharite communities today. They're quite small and isolated in different ways, but it still is a stream of Judaism that exists today, a kind of minority stream. It's interesting because what Rabbi Ovadia said, that he couldn't tell whether they were rabbinic Jews, Rabbinite Jews, or Kharite Jews, is very telling because actually they are their own thing, right? The Ethiopians' customs and practices are neither that of the rabbis as we, meaning Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews, have it, nor the practice of the Kharite Jews. Shortly after that, a famous rabbi, one of the leading rabbis of Egypt, also went down to visit them, or at least he describes it doing so. He describes it slightly differently, which is interesting. He describes it as perpetual wars between the kings of Kush. Kush is another word for Ethiopia broadly. Ethiopia, Sudan, parts of Egypt, basically East Africa, which has 3 kingdoms, part of which belongs to the Ishmaelites, that's the Muslims, part of which belongs to the Christians, and part of which to the Israelites from the tribe of Dan. So in his time, he understands it. Sorry about that. Clicked on the link. In his time, he understands it. Hang on. Sorry, screen share. He understands that, there we go, that these Jews who he sees and encounters, or at least hears about, are actually part of a kingdom of Israelites, which are fighting against a kingdom of Christians and a kingdom of Muslims, which is not too wrong, by the way. What's now Somalia is the historic Muslim kingdom. What's now Ethiopia is the historic Christian kingdom. What's now Yemen is the historic Jewish kingdom. And they were all fighting each other. There were Jewish kings and queens ruling parts of these lands for long periods of time, during the same time that the Jews in Europe were absolutely unknown and destitute and really struggling. Right? During the First Crusade, for instance, when the Jews of Europe were being massacred, there was a Jewish queen who was rampaging through the kingdom of Aksum and burning down the palaces, named Yehudit. And she was the terror of the Christians at the time. There was a very different history. One involves kind of a lot of Jewish militarism, Jewish sovereignty, and a lot of conflict. He describes, in all likelihood, they're from the sect of Sadok and Boetius. This is a reference to what we call the Siddukim, or the Sadducees, one of the sects of Jews in the 1st century, who mostly died out, but were very focused on the temple. What he says, they're now called Kharites, since they only know a few of the biblical commandments. But they're unfamiliar with the oral law, they don't light Shabbat candles, war ceases not from amongst them, and every day they take captives from one another. So he describes the situation in the East Africa and the Horn of Africa as being very violent, which it was, but also gives us a window into the fact there is this sort of idiosyncratic Jewish community which is engaged in constant conflict with its Christian and Muslim neighbors. Again, a very different history than what was happening in Europe or in Muslim countries during this time. Over here you can see part of the text of the Torah, written in Ge'ez, by the way, which is called Orit, which is related to the Aramaic word Oraita or Torah, all the same word. I don't know where my picture went here. Oh, there it is. So the Ethiopian Jews called their religion Haymanot, which means faith. Again, like the Hebrew word emunah, Haymanot. And their version of Judaism is labeled by that term. Again, it developed partially because of their isolation, but it also was a result of them having different books. So we don't talk about it a lot, but the rabbis, who we trace our history to, canonized the Tanakh. They chose what books were going to go in and what books were not going to go in. There was lots of books they could have put in and didn't, and some books they put in the Tanakh that maybe they shouldn't have. There was a lot of conflict around Song of Songs, for instance, whether that should be in the Tanakh or not. I'm glad it is. But that process was actually quite complicated. And not only was that complicated, even what's counted as the Torah evidently was also somewhat complicated, because in the Ethiopian community, they don't have the 5 books of Moses. They have the 8 books. They have the same Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but they also include the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth as part of the Torah, which is a huge difference, right? We do have Joshua, Judges, and Ruth in the Tanakh, but we don't consider them to be as holy as the Torah. They're secondary importance, they're prophetic books, etc. So that's a big difference and affects some of the ways in which the Ethiopian Jews understand Judaism. Their broader Bible, the canon, what we call the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, for them also included lots of books that were rejected by the rabbis. A book called Sirach, a book called Edras, books that we never learn, and most of us never heard about, sometimes called Apocrypha. In addition to all this, they also had some books that were entirely unique to the Ethiopian community that didn't exist elsewhere. And actually, the Ethiopian Jews preserved quite a few Jewish Hebrew books in Ethiopian Ge'ez translation, which were lost elsewhere, some of which are actually quite familiar to the rabbis, books like Enoch and Jubilees and other apocryphal works. So they have a very different scripture then, as a result. It's basically the same core, except they include Joshua, Judges, and Ruth as part of the Torah, but there's also some books that are quite different. So it changes the way you perceive Judaism when you include things that the rabbis purposefully chose not to include. The picture here is of a synagogue in a village in Ethiopia. You can see it, as much of the construction as in Ethiopia, it's kind of built with thatch. And you can see, I think it's probably a recent development, but there's a giant Star of David that someone stuck on the top of the roof. That probably wasn't there historically because they didn't know that symbol. That was a European Jewish symbol. But now, if you go and visit this synagogue, it looks exactly like it did in the time that the Ethiopian Jews were primarily using it, except it's got this giant Star of David on top, a European Jewish symbol, which, again, we'll come back to how Ethiopian Jews have interacted with not other Jews, for non-Ethiopian Jews. A little bit about leadership, which is something that many people are aware of. There's different structure in leadership. This gentleman on the left, Rafael Hadane, who's one of the most influential leaders of the Ethiopian Jewish community in the 20th century. He is not called a rabbi. Historically, they called the leaders of the community Kahen, which of course is like a Kohen, a priest. They didn't perform sacrifices, but they actually served a role a lot like a rabbi would serve, but were called Kahen, which is interesting. In Amharic, the Christian language, they were called Kes, which is what's used today. So in modern Israel, the leaders of the Ethiopian community are called Kesim, rather than rabbis. And there were also other kind of roles for people in the Ethiopian leadership, many of which rabbinic Jews never had. So, for instance, one is a monk. They had monasticism, Jewish monasticism. So there were monasteries where leaders of the Ethiopian Jews would choose to be celibate and go off into the wilderness and study Torah, which is something you would never, ever hear of in rabbinic circles officially, although some yeshivas definitely are like monasteries. And they also had a practice of having initiate kind of like in the Christian church, deacons, kind of priests who were in training, who were leading services and doing pastoral work and whatever else. So it's interesting because this model of leadership, these three tiers of the initiate, the Debtera, the Kahen, who was the primary leader, and the monks, who were few but very significant and held in high esteem, obviously is a lot like the structure of the Christian Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So you can see ways in which there's kind of influence from Ethiopian Christianity on Ethiopian Judaism, which of course makes sense. There's lots of ways in which European Christianity has influenced European Judaism, right? The United Synagogue, this is a sidebar, but in case you don't realize, the United Synagogue is just the Church of England, but everything's in Hebrew, right? They took the exact same structure as the Church of England and made it for Jews. It's totally foreign to Judaism to have a chief rabbi, something that was made up 150 years ago. And that's because we just took the structure of leadership from Christian society. That's also what the Ethiopian Jews did. The result was that they had monasteries and monks, celibate monks, and it meant that they understood their leaders to be slightly different. One big difference was around kashrut and purity type laws. Obviously, if you don't have the Talmud, in which the rabbis decide that they want to interpret the statement, don't boil a kid in his mother's milk, very widely, then you might interpret kashrut differently, and they did, as the Kharites did. This is probably one of the things that led those rabbis to go, well, they're kind of like the Kharites, but they're kind of like us, is that they actually don't separate milk and meat, historically, but there was a lot of focus on kosher slaughter. The case, or kahen, the leader, would slaughter his own meat. Everyone had to learn how to slaughter their own meat if they wanted to eat meat. And there was a very strict prohibition in certain times on not eating the food of the non-Jewish Ethiopians, the Christians around them. Although there wasn't the persecution of European Christianity, meaning ghettos and anti-Semitism as we know it, there was quite a bit of discrimination against the Ethiopian Jewish community. That's partially because there was a history of violence between the two. Remember, there was two fighting kingdoms and the Jews lost. So there was a lot of discrimination historically up until the 20th century. Ethiopian Jews were restricted to certain professions, certain places they could live, were often accused of crimes they didn't commit, things that are familiar to us from any Christian country, which had a Jewish minority. And it's interesting to see that actually, even though we're talking about Africa and not Europe, similar issues happened because Christianity was the dominant religion, and that informed how people approached Judaism, even though it's a very different type of Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is seen by most European Christians as heretics, but in essence, the same values of Christianity are there. So the big change and the role that the gentleman we just saw, Rafael Hadane, had was partially the fact that things got so bad for the Ethiopian Jews in the 20th century, and after Israel was created, they started the process of trying to make mass emigration to Israel. There was a famous letter that was written by some of the Kesim, the leaders of the Ethiopian Jews, to kind of the worldwide Jewish community, saying that they wanted help to get out, that they were persecuted, that they were struggling, that they were poor, that they needed help. And it eventually made its way bureaucratically to the Israeli Ministry of Absorption, which some of you may be familiar with if you've ever made Aliyah or considered making Aliyah. It's a frustratingly bureaucratic organization. In 1973, the Absorption Ministry decided that actually the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, were not Jewish, and thus no one needed to bother helping them. What changed is that a rabbi got involved. And it's a really interesting window into kind of modern Israel and rabbinic power. The rabbi is a very interesting one, Ovadia Yosef. For those who don't know who Ovadia Yosef was, he was the kind of one of the most significant rabbis of the 20th century. He was from Iraq and was the chief rabbi, the Sephardi chief rabbi in Israel from like 1960 to 2000, basically. He didn't always hold that role, but he was the most influential Sephardi rabbi during that time. He died early 2000s. He was a very complicated, controversial guy who actually later in life was known for being a racist. But in 1973, when the Ministry of Absorption said, yeah, these aren't Jews, he decided on the basis of Jewish literature, like those quotes we looked at a moment ago, that they were Jews. And that he said in his tshuva, in his paper, that not only did they have a right to emigrate to Israel under the law of return, They also needed a proper Jewish education to teach them about real Judaism, a certain degree of paternalism here. And actually, he said it was a mitzvah to do so, to bring back these lost tribes. What's interesting is that the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Shlomo Goren, kind of refused to agree. He didn't disagree, but he wouldn't agree in the same terms. He wouldn't issue an official statement. However, despite the Ministry of Absorption saying they're not Jews, and the Ashkenazi chief rabbi saying, yeah, I don't know, we're not really sure, Rabbi Yosef, Ovadia Yosef, was so influential and pushed this so hard that actually he convinced enough people to put together a kind of inter-office staff specifically to help the Ethiopian Jews emigrate to the land of Israel. It caused lots of interesting halachic questions about whether or not they needed to convert, whether they should do a conversion just to be safe, whether some were Jews and some were not, and how do you decide, and whatever else, things that are very familiar to us in modern discussions in Israel around who is a Jew. But actually in the 1970s, it wasn't quite as acute of an issue, and Rabbi Yosef, for all of his flaws, actually was very, very stern about the fact that these were Jews and they need to come back, and that was it. And he would not rest until that was the case. So over the late 1970s, you started to see small groups of Ethiopian Jews immigrating, mostly the ones who could afford to do so, making aliyah legally and recognized as Jews doing so. Gradually in 1984 and then in 1991, there was two huge movements of Ethiopian Jews, by which by the year 2000, there's about 150,000 Ethiopian Jews in Israel today. That's only about 2% of the Jewish Israeli population, by the way. It's not a huge amount, but it is very significant culturally, partially because they are so different in some way. The Judaism they practice is different. The obviously race with which they're identified is different, whatever that term means. And there's a great deal of discrimination from other Jews towards Ethiopian Jews even today, and also some kind of romanticization and tokenization of like, look, we've got black Jews too, which is not always very helpful. There are also Jews of different varieties who are still in Ethiopia, who were refused immigration, some because they had converted to Christianity under pressure of 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and it wasn't clear whether they needed to convert back to Judaism or not, or how that works. And there's still actually an ongoing kind of debate over whether there are still people in Ethiopia who should be brought over. There's quite a few people working to bring over about 23,000 Ethiopian Jews who are part of a slightly different group, who again had converted to Christianity and then back. But it hasn't really been successful. And in many ways, the population has stayed the same. Like all immigrants to Israel, and Israel is a funny country because everyone's an immigrant, basically. When Ethiopian Jews first arrived, they were settled in what's called ma'abarot, which are kind of temporary camps, kind of displaced person camps. And gradually they moved out of those, as all immigrants have in Israel's history, and moved into certain cities and certain areas. There's today a very large Ethiopian population in the south of Israel, particularly in the towns of Netivot and Sderot, towns that you might see in the news because they're the ones that get hit by the rockets from Gaza quite often. They're quite close to the border. They're also very underprivileged towns and often underserved by the government in Tel Aviv. That is starting to change, and there is large Ethiopian communities now in the big cities, in Tel Aviv and in Yerushalayim, in Haifa, etc. But it's gradual, and it's only really because of generational changes. When the Jews arrived from Ethiopia, the government, because in Israel, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, which is the Rabbanut, the chief rabbi, again, that's an Ottoman version of the same phenomenon, appointed 60 of the Kesim, of the leaders, the Kehanot of the Ethiopian community, to be official state ministers. But they're not rabbis, and they're not empowered to conduct weddings in Israel. So they're kind of stuck. They're in a bit of a limbo in that they're recognized as official leaders of their community, but they're not empowered to do the same things that the rabbis are empowered to do who graduate from Ashkenazi and Sephardi yeshivot. What that has resulted in is that now young Ethiopian Jews who want to lead their community are not training in the ways of the Kesim of old. They're not training with their own ancestors. They're going to Lithuanian yeshivot where everyone speaks Yiddish and wears a black hat. in order to train there to be recognized as a real rabbi. And as a result, the actual customs and traditions of the Ethiopian community, the halachic view and the kind of the view of Judaism as it's practiced is gradually being eroded by assimilation, intra-Jewish assimilation. There's an expression in Israel that some people may have come across called korach hituch, which is the salad bowl. It's kind of the equivalent of the melting pot in America. Everyone comes from somewhere and they all kind of melt together. Salad bowl is a slightly different image because when you make a salad, everything gets cut up separately, but they don't all mix together. They're still identifiable. And that's really key to Israelis' identities. You can come from Morocco or Yemen or Poland or Lithuania or America or Britain or whatever, but you still keep your own thing. You go to the Moroccan synagogue, you have your own customs. That hasn't really been true for the Ethiopian community, despite the fact that out of all the Jewish communities, they have the most unique customs. They've been pressured through legal and cultural means to try and basically assimilate into other Jewish communities. Couple photos here, which are interesting. So from clockwise, this is an album cover from Aiden Alain, who is a singer. She won the Israeli version of X Factor a couple years ago and was actually the Eurovision entry in 2020, which was delayed until 2021. She sings sometimes in Amharic, sometimes in Arabic, sometimes in English, and sometimes in Hebrew. You can see the album, the name of the song, this is from her single, is there in 4 languages, transliterated from Amharic, at least, into English. The word is, in Hebrew, it's ahuv libi, meaning my heart's love. So you can see the multilingual nature of the Ethiopian community by virtue of their history. She is an example of the success of a lot of Ethiopian Jews. They're now Ethiopian members of Knesset, and there are significant civil society professors, lawyers, lecturers, etc., representing the Ethiopian community, which is great. But there's also a lot of deprivation of Ethiopian heavy towns and a lot of racism and discrimination within Israeli society. The photo next to that here is the Ethiopian Synagogue in Netivot. You can see it's designed quite differently than what most synagogues might look like. And I believe it was based on some of the traditional designs for the synagogues that were found in Ethiopia, all of which are gone, by the way, right? That's part of it is everyone left. And there's not really a connection to Ethiopia still, although Ethiopia and Israel are allies. There's not a lot of people that wanted to stay behind. Actually, on the journey, quite a few people died. That's because the Israelis at the time had to evacuate them from Sudan, not from Ethiopia, at least in the first operation, which is called Operation Moses. So the Ethiopian Jews had to cross the border into Sudan, which is a war zone and has been for a long time. And then the Mossad and other Israeli organizations airlifted them from Sudan to Israel. Many people, particularly the elderly and infirm, died during that journey, during the transport, during the conflict. And there's actually a memorial. This is a picture from Mount Herzl, which is where all of the Jewish Israeli war memorials are, where all the military graves are. One of the memorials is actually to the 4,000 Ethiopian Jews who died trying to get to Israel. It's really interesting. And just that you can see the construction of it looks like people falling over in a kind of abstract way. So it is recognized, right? There's not kind of any official discrimination. There's definitely a celebration of the fact that Ethiopian Jews are part of Israeli culture. But obviously that doesn't stop people from being racist sometimes. Below on the bottom left is a photo from a protest that took place in Tel Aviv, in one of the particularly deprived neighborhoods of South Tel Aviv, which was particularly against racial discrimination. This wasn't just from the Ethiopian community, but also the fact that there was lots of East Africans who were asylum seekers in Israel, who were living in South Tel Aviv, mostly from Eritrea. And the Ethiopian Jews felt a kind of natural link with people who were from the same culture and background as they were, and were refugees and asylum seekers, not Jewish, but were there trying to hide from war. And it led to quite a bit of conflict in Tel Aviv about 4 years ago, and quite a few protests and quite a few issues. The government basically kicked them all out in the end. There's quite a bit of Ethiopian Israelis in music, and particularly in contemporary music and pop music and rap music. And not only did Aiden get nominated as the Eurovision entry, but also there was another winner, Kharit Judaism, who won the Israeli show Kochav Nolad, which means a star is born. It's again one of these singing shows. I don't know which one it translates to. Little bit about Sigd, which is the thing that prompted us to think about this tonight. Sigd is one of the holidays that is unique to the Ethiopian community, meaning most other Jews didn't know about it and don't observe it. It happens on the 29th of Cheshvan, which is again on the 4th of November. Is that Thursday? It was originally actually on the 29th of Kislev during Hanukkah, but the Ethiopian Jews don't have Hanukkah. They don't celebrate Hanukkah or Purim because by the time that Hanukkah and Purim were created as holidays, they had already been cut off from the rest of the Jewish world. So originally they celebrated Sigd during the end of Kislev. When they started learning about Rabbinic Judaism and started being pressured to celebrate Hanukkah, they moved it to the 29th of Cheshvan, which actually works well because it makes it connected to Yom Kippur. Right, the 29th of Cheshvan, again, a couple days from now, is exactly 50 days after Yom Kippur, which they see as symbolic, like Shavuot is 50 days after Pesach. Sigd is kind of the equivalent second go at Yom Kippur. There's a tradition to fast, as there is in Yom Kippur. Everyone makes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which you can see in the photo on the left there. And there's a public gathering, theoretically, of all of the Ethiopian community, in which they read their version of the Torah, called Orit, aloud in Ge'ez. There's several kind of customs. You can see that the kesim, right, the men here, are dressed in the traditional way that the kesim, or the case, or kahens were dressed in Ethiopia. Lots of white garments, white turbans. This, again, you might realize, is a direct version of what the priests are described as wearing in the Torah. They wore white breeches, white tunics, white turbans. That's exactly what they did. So it makes a lot of sense, actually. The rabbis distanced themselves from that, but the Ethiopian Jews didn't. They embraced the imagery of the priesthood, even though they had no temple and no connection to one. Sigd has become, actually, in 2008, an official Israeli state holiday, which means people get time off work, and actually it's created a culture in which non-Ethiopians now participate. You'll see cultural events for Sigd among non-Ethiopian Jews to learn about Ethiopian Judaism, to visit the Ethiopian community, to take part in the celebrations, in the fasting, in the reading of the Torah. Actually, it's something that's been quite a big aspect of education, is the fact that now they have to teach about Sigd in schools, so kids learn about Ethiopian Judaism, and it's become quite a big symbol. I'm not sure where it comes from, but they have this tradition of these brightly colored umbrellas, which everyone seems to carry with them on the procession to Jerusalem. I guess it's quite practical if it's hot out, as it often is in Cheshvan. That's one of the big symbols, is if you're in Jerusalem for Sigd, you'll see just huge processions of these bright colored umbrellas of people making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in order to read the Torah aloud and to take part in the festivities. Couple more things from me, and then I'm not too qualified to answer any questions, but if anyone has any, I'm happy to. Just a few things to talk about kind of where we are today. The page on the left, if we start with that, this is a Siddur. This is a scan from a page of a Siddur. This is a Siddur published by Koren, which are a mainstream Orthodox publisher of Jewish books. They're the ones that publish the daily authorized prayer book of the chief rabbi, for instance. They also, one of the books they publish is a bilingual Hebrew and Amharic Siddur, which is really interesting and it represents many different aspects of this whole question, because on one hand, it shows that there's an inclusion of Ethiopian practice and language, because most Ethiopian Jews speak Amharic. You can see the prayers are written out in Ge'ez. It's very easy to translate, actually, because it's such a similar language to Hebrew. On the other hand, these aren't their prayers. Right? These are the prayers that the rabbinic Jews spoke in the rest of the world. So there's a kind of very much cultural awareness mixed with pressure to assimilate and to be like all the rest of the Jews, which characterizes the relationship that a lot of people have in Israel with Ethiopian Judaism, which is good and bad, right? There's a kind of Orientalism to it. A lot of European Jews go, "Oh, how cool, we have these Jews too." As long as they do exactly what we do, they're fine. When people discuss too much that they have their own customs, or they do kashrut differently, or they observe Shabbat differently, it causes problems. So I imagine over time, in the next couple of generations, eventually all of these kind of historic customs of the Ethiopian Jews will be forgotten, and they'll assimilate to the generic kind of Sephardi or Ashkenazi practice in Israel. Probably a Sephardi one, but again, there's not much difference really today. There's pressure in general for Sephardim and Ashkenazim to do the same thing. Right, there's an Ashkenazification of Sephardi culture, and that's such a small difference. So you can imagine, relative to Ethiopian Jewish culture, which is quite different, that pressure is even more acute. So I think this Siddur is a very good indication of this kind of two-sided, two-faced approach to it. On one hand, I'm very glad it's there. It's interesting, it's good, and it shows a reflection and interest in the community, but it also tokenizes and actually kind of assimilates them as a result of that. No one bothered to make a Siddur which reflected the prayers they did say. So that's an element of it. Another piece of it is how, obviously, crimes in the Ethiopian community and actually how Ethiopian soldiers are dealt with. There's a very famous case, which you may have heard about this gentleman here, Avera Mengistu. He's a young man who disappeared into Gaza in 2014, I believe, after the war. He's got mental health problems and wasn't well, and was basically allowed to walk over the border. Right, you can't just walk into Gaza, by the way. He walked from his home in Sderot, the 10 miles to the Gaza border, and the soldiers just let him walk through, which they've never been an explanation for. He ended up climbing a fence and they didn't stop him. And as a result, disappeared into Gaza in that year. He hasn't been seen since. Hamas, who rules Gaza, has claimed that they have him as a prisoner, but it's not clear if he's alive or dead. And what's really telling is that Israel's done basically nothing to try and find out. So you may be aware that when, for instance, an Israeli soldier is captured, as has been several times by Hamas, and taken into Gaza, Israel will move literally heaven and earth and make very foolish strategic decisions solely to get the soldier back. Israel's quite well known, actually, for making foolhardy operations to try and save an individual soldier. They're not willing to do that for this gentleman, for Avera Mengistu. And as a result, it's definitely become a kind of protest movement around how non-white, non-Ashkenazi Jews are viewed in the army, in society, as expendable, as insignificant, etc. And although it's quite a difficult case, he wasn't a soldier, he wasn't captured in wartime, he appears to have gone voluntarily, although he was very ill. It's still telling that the government has kind of done very little to try and recover him, whether he's alive or dead even. So you'll see sometimes people in Israel walking around with t-shirts that have this guy's face on them, exactly this photo, drawn as a cartoon. There's a lot of people that talk and think about him, and has become a touch point for understanding how Ethiopian Judaism and Ethiopian Jews are treated in Israel. Last thing I wanted to do, and then I will shut the presentation and happy to answer any questions if I can, is play a little bit of music, because music is often a good indication of culture. This is a band called Cafe Shachor Chazak. For Hebrew speakers, will know that means very strong coffee, or strong black coffee, literally, strong black coffee. They're two gentlemen who unusually have broken into mainstream Israeli music and been quite popular, and they basically have a kind of very R&B or rap style of singing, which is influenced not by Ethiopian culture, but by looking wider, especially at America, and seeing how African Americans address their culture and how they use it through hip hop, through the culture of African Americans, and kind of re-importing that to Israel as a way to address Ethiopian Jewish concerns within Israeli society. Which is very interesting. Globalism has changed the way that people see themselves. And as a result, rap has become quite popular in the Ethiopian Jewish society, even though it has no direct connection historically with that culture. So I'll just play this. Hopefully you can hear it. The music video is pretty boring, but the song's great. You hear that? Robin, give me a thumbs up if you can hear it. Cool.
That's a rough one.
רק לעלות זה מה שנותר, לא הצלחת תנסה מחר, העולם ייתן לך מתנות בשפע, לא כתוב בשום מקום שלנסות זה פשע. אני שורד עם אפוד מגן, לא מפסיק פה לנגן, חלומות למרות שמתנפצים לי בפרצוף זה לא הוגן אם נופל או משתפן הולך קדימה ולכן החיים הם כמו רולטה אז אני לא מתלונן לא אני לא מחכה בתור לא יעצורתי שום רמזור עם רצון ואמונה בסוף אמצא את האור דלתות שנסגרות מולי אותן פותח עם מסור הולך קדימה לא שוכח מה היה אתמול מיליוני שירים כתבתי הם נזרקו לפח אני לא מפסיק עד יום מותי אחי האדמה הפח על הטרק הזה של רף אם היא רואה אח אני לא צריך שאף בן זונה יגיד שאני שייך
רק לעלות זה מה שנותר לא הצלחת תנסה מחר העולם ייתן לך מתנות בשפע לא כתוב בשום מקום שלנסות זה פשע רק לעלות זה מה שנותר לא הצלחת תנסה מחר העולם ייתן לך מתנות בשפע לא כתוב בשום מקום שלנסות זה פשע
אש בעיניים אני מוכן זה בניין חדש אני דייר ישן מספק את הסחורה יותר טוב מסוכן נדל"ן עם מראה מטה שלא תיתן נוצרתי מיזם מסוכן וכאן מפציץ עם חומר שגורם לכם לקום שכל השאר גורמים לכם לצום עם טקסטים אנורקסים חרוזים שהם בעצם אקסים מאכיל אתכם במנות של רף ללא ברקסים
סמיילי שמתרחב לי על הפנים למדפקה שיושבים ומקנים
הדרך למטרה לא קלה נהנה מהדרך עד שיכתירו אותי כמלך וינשקו לי את הברך כי זה פאקינג הישרדות זה פאקינג התאבדות להישאר אתה בעולם שמתנהג הפוך אז לחיות או למות למשוך את החוט אני מעדיף ללפף לעצמי סביבת ספר את החוט
רק לעלות זה מה שנותר לא הצלחת תנסה מחר העולם ייתן לך מתנות בשפע לא כתוב בשום מקום שלנסות זה פשע רק לעלות זה מה שנותר לא הצלחת תנסה מחר העולם ייתן לך מתנות בשפע לא כתוב בשום מקום שלנסות זה פשע
יש בי אהבה ואמונה היא תנצח את ההזדמנות בשתי ידיים אני לוקח בשעות הכי קטנות קורים דברים גדולים הפכתי את החלום למציאות שבחיים יש בי אהבה ואמונה היא תנצח את ההזדמנות בשתי ידיים אני לוקח בשעות הכי קטנות קורים דברים גדולים הפכתי את החלום למציאות שבחיים
רק לעלות זה מה שנותר לא הצלחת תנסה מחר העולם ייתן לך מתנות בשפע לא כתוב בשום מקום שלנסות זה פשע רק לעלות זה מה שנותר לא הצלחת תנסה מחר העולם ייתן לך מתנות בשפע לא כתוב בשום מקום שלנסות זה פשע
Right, so you see two young men whose parents probably came from some tiny village in Ethiopia, never knew a word of Hebrew, never really probably knew the degree to which Judaism had existed in the rest of the world, who've grown up in Israel with all the complexities that we've talked about in terms of how race and culture are viewed, are using Hebrew as a medium for expressing that. A lot of their lyrics are about the experience of Ethiopians. You would have heard as well, if you've studied Hebrew a little bit, there's quite a bit of slang and a fair amount of English curse words which get slipped in there. And it's indicative in some way of the situation as it is today. So I think it's actually, it's Sigd coming up. It's on the calendar. It should be. It's quite important for us, no matter what our relationship with it is, to understand. And it's also quite important for non-Jews to see that Judaism is a very diverse community, complex, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilinguistic, and more than anything else, the experience and history of the Ethiopian Jews represent that well. So any questions people have, happy to answer if I can, or recommend other good resources. But thank you for joining me to learn a little bit about it tonight. Oh, yes. Shiloh's pointed out something great. So there's a charity in the UK, actually, that I discovered recently called Maketa, which supports one of the communities of Jews that have remained in Ethiopia who have not been eligible for Aliyah. It's complicated why. They weave talitot, and they are imported to the UK and sold, and it actually seems like quite a good charity. The profits go back to the community, and the talitot are beautiful. Shiloh's just gotten theirs, I believe, from them, and if anyone's seen Ruth Rabin in Shul, she's got one from them as well. Really good reminder as well, yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure. Robin, do you have a question? Yeah, sorry.
I guess so. It's just, in a way, it's sort of surprising that it's such a unique situation that there aren't more groups that have developed their own sort of distinct version of Judaism?
There are a few, to be fair. A lot of them are very tiny. So the Samaritan community, which remained in the land of Israel, which had a different custom and a different practice, there's about 700 of them left on Mount Gerizim. They're still there. There are some other isolated Jewish communities which are quite old and go back a long time. But a lot of it is that actually so much of the Jewish community was destroyed in the wars against Rome, that unless you had established a solid presence, which was backed up by military strength before that, wasn't much chance you were going to last. So the Himyarite Kingdom was there. There was a Jewish kingdom in Yemen for hundreds of years, which were a power in the ancient Middle East. Nothing remains of them today. And in some way it's luck, but it's also the fact that the Ethiopian Jewish community continued to take up arms to defend themselves for a long time. And as that rabbi reported, constantly were fighting wars with their neighbors. I think that's part of the reason why they survived, that others didn't actually, is that kind of history of violence kept them as a community. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. Where are the other ones that we don't know about as well? Joseph, yeah?
So I noticed, Adam, you picked one of the particular theories. I don't know if you're aware, but like there's two particular theories about how the Ethiopian Jews came about. So they have a telling where they're descended from the tribe of Dan, and they have an ethnic connection to the Judaism, where somehow Jews ended up in Ethiopia and they found a community there. There's also this other theory that's kind of the second one. I don't know which one I believe more. I think I probably tend towards your one, where so if people aren't already aware, like Ethiopian Christianity is a lot more Old Testament than Western Christianity. So for example, they circumcise their sons, they don't eat pork. So the theory is called like the rebel theory. What happened according to this theory is that in around the 13th, 14th century, the area of Semien gradually adopted more and more Old Testament practices as sort of an act of political rebellion to the Ethiopian emperor. And so the theory is that they came to identify as Jews eventually because they kept adopting more and more and more Old Testament practices. I think that also explains why, for example, they don't know about Hanukkah because it's not in the Old Testament. They don't know. They didn't have rabbis in the Ethiopian community, did they, Adam?
They weren't called that, but they certainly had leaders. It's one of the things, I think you came in a bit late, but it's one of the things we talked a little bit about. Yes, I mean, I actually didn't know that particular version of it, but as with most of these things, it's probably a combination, right? It's probably there was a community, and then there were also refugees from the Jewish kingdom that fought against them who joined that community, and there were also probably political elements. There's a famous story about this queen Godit or Yehudit who fought against the Christians who may or may not have existed. It's so hard, and the records are very poor, and unfortunately, the area where most of this is actually critically happening, the area of Tigray, is currently in the midst of a genocide. As we speak, right? The government of Ethiopia is massacring people, claiming there's an insurgency, not clear if there is. So it makes it very hard to do any real archaeological work in this part of the world as a result. But yeah, really interesting, Joseph. I didn't know that one.
Adam, what's their relationship with temple and temple practices? So, for example, obviously we have Hamidah, sort of a surrogate for temple practice. Do they have anything like that, or?
So I don't know too much about the authentic prayer traditions of the community. It's a good question. I do know that the scholarly assumption is that the religious influence on the community came not from the temple in Jerusalem, as ours did, but in there was a rival temple at a place called Elephantine, which is a river, an island in the middle of the Nile River. And scholars believe that this community and similar communities in Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa were probably kind of satellites of that temple. So it's not clear how big that temple was, but it was definitely a rival to the Jerusalem temple and had a different approach to things. And I imagine as a result, they have similar temple-based practices and temple-based culture. It's good to have the history nerds here. I really am pleased. Joseph and Lee and Beverly, who's just had to duck out, and everyone else. If you find some interesting resources on this question, I am learning as well, and I would love to learn more. So please do share them. And on Thursday, on this Thursday, on Sigd, see if you can participate online or virtually. There'll be live streams from Jerusalem of the event, and you can see if you can listen in and learn more about it for the sake of the community and for the sake of Jewish diversity, because it's quite important. So thank you guys for joining.